Well, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us here tonight. My name is Pete Eberle, and I'm with NCRES, the Colorado Renewable Energy Society. For those of you who are new to our events, NCRES and its local chapters provide education, policy advocacy, and community engagement that accelerate Colorado towards a carbon neutral future powered by 100% renewable energy. Founded in 1996, NCRES is a statewide, nonpartisan 501c3 that is supported by our sustaining individual and business members, as well as donations. You can sign up for our newsletter, event announcements, social media, and become a member or donor by visiting www.cres-energy.org, cres-energy.org. Also make sure to visit our YouTube channel where we have over 200 previously recorded videos such as this. Before we get started, I'd like to give a quick thanks to our gigawatt and megawatt business sponsors, Solaris Energy, Moss Adams, Poudre Valley Rural Electric Association, Fenton Instruments, Kelly Government Solutions, and Platte River Power Authority. A couple of quick announcements on upcoming events. This Thursday, October 26th at 7 p.m., we will have high performance windows indoors in open and shut case featuring Todd Collins of Alpin Windows. That'll be in Golden, Colorado at the Jefferson Unitarian Church. And then on Wednesday, November 8th at 5 p.m., we'll have a webinar examining Xcel's clean heat plan and why it matters to you. The NCRES policy team, along with Physicians for Social Responsibility Colorado, will be discussing the currently proposed Xcel Clean Heat Plan and providing some critiques on some concerns there. So again, that'll be November 8th at 5 p.m. You can find registration information by visiting cres-energy.org and going to the events tab. And let me just clear out my items here and make Kevin the presenter. Okay, Kevin, I think you should have it.
Thank you, Pete. And I think my slides are showing there. Great.
Yep, looks great.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Good evening. I'm Kevin Brehm. As Pete said, I'm a manager with RMI, where I lead the VP3 or Virtual Power Plant Partnership. I'm calling in from RMI's office in Basalt, Colorado right now, where I drove up back to the office so we didn't have to be exposed to the risk of any drama as my 6-year-old and 9-year-old were going to bed. Thank you, all of you, for joining on your Tuesday night. You know, as I was driving up, I was considering what would motivate folks to be excited about joining, to have 39 slides shared with them on a Tuesday night. And I think first, again, I appreciate your commitment, you're showing up, but, I think VPPs are really having a moment, and that's something that we've seen this year, and I can share a little bit about. As I was driving up and reflecting on this a little bit, to me, one of the things that's really exciting when it comes to VPPs, and thinking of someone who's been at RMI for a while, Amory Levins, founder of RMI, sort of kicked off all the work we're doing with this vision of a renewable future, but also one that is powered through sort of, his term was soft energy paths, one that's really driven by distributed energy resources, distributed generation. And we're starting to see, and really over the past decade where I worked at RMI, we've seen pieces of this starting to come into fruition. Solar has really come into its own and achieved a level of maturity. And we're seeing a variety of technologies adopted on the utility scale and on the home front. I think the thing that I'm reflecting on, I think is really exciting as we enter this next path is for distributed energy resources is thinking, not only how they're going to transform the way we consume energy as consumers, but how they're going to transform the way that we interact as communities, that we interact as a society through the power grid, and really how these distributed energy resources are able to provide critical services to communities and society in that way. So some reflections as I was coming up, I want to share with you, just to give you a sense of where we're going to go. I think I have some pretty broad remarks that I'm going to share and say this is sort of like a 101, 201, maybe a little beyond there. Overview of virtual power plants. So I'm going to be leveraging work that we've done at RMI. I'm also going to be heavily leveraging work that Department of Energy has done through their virtual power plant liftoff report. So I want to recognize and thank them for all their work on this. So the agenda is basically to start with definitions and a few examples to set the ground, speaking a little bit about VPP benefits, and I have some examples as well as some unpublished RMI research that I can share. Thinking a little bit about the market potential, where are VPPs going? Next, recent trends. What are we sensing through our work working with technology and service providers when it comes to recent trends with VPPs, imperatives for growth, what barriers need to be addressed for the industry to grow, and finally, sharing a little bit about what we're doing at VP3 Virtual Power Plant Partnership. So with that, if you're not familiar with RMI, RMI is an independent nonprofit organization of experts accelerating the clean energy transition. Our mission is to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero carbon future for all. So if you are familiar with RMI, that's probably familiar. Even if you are familiar with RMI, I think a couple things that have really changed as an organization. And again, I started a little more than 9 years ago, and we had less than 100 people. And now we have around 700 people. We've gone from Colorado-based organization to a global organization. So it's been really exciting to see that transition. We're solidly focused on energy. So I'm part of our electricity program. And we also work across other key sectors, buildings, transportation, and industry. We focus on using powerful market catalysts. So a variety of my colleagues are focused in one way on leveraging those market catalysts if they're not part of one of the sectoral focused programs. Now about Virtual Power Plant Partnership, the initiative that I work on. It is an initiative housed within RMI. It's funded by industry leaders spanning the automotive, building, energy, service, and software sectors, so namely our members, who you can see on the right. Our mission is to catalyze industry and change the necessary policies, regulations, and market rules for VPPs to scale in ways that benefit communities and society. So I think we'll unpack some of that. We'll unpack a little bit about what are some of the benefits I'm speaking to, what are some of the policies and regulations, and I invite and welcome discussion at the end, I think through the chat function, as a means for us to have some conversation. So I think I'll go ahead and present the remarks, and then at the end, Pete will moderate some discussion using questions that have emerged through chat. And you can see on the right, I'm not going to name all of them, but I think one of the really exciting things about Virtual Power Plant Partnership, and sort of one of the exciting things from the start, is that virtual power plants really bring together a variety of technology and service providers. So I think if you see this list, you might be familiar with some names that are well known in the industry. I mean, I'd say certainly when it comes to the solar industry, Sunrun and SunPower are a couple leaders. But then also seeing sort of the really critical role of energy service providers, distributed energy resource management providers, automakers joining the conversation. So it's one of the really interesting and exciting things, sort of the variety of technology and service providers whose business either fundamentally depend on or in many ways touch on virtual power plants. So, you know, as another framing, and this, again, I'm borrowing from the Department of Energy, thinking about the need for VPPs. US peak demand is expected to grow by approximately 60 gigawatts between 2023 and 2030. So after, you know, a decade or so, or even more than a decade of relatively flat growth, we're going to see growth start to tick up. And we're going to see growth continue to tick up in the coming decades. So it's clear that we are going to need to figure out how to manage and operate our system and expand our system to meet this growing demand. Not only that, coincident with that, and through 2030, we're expecting around 140 gigawatts of thermal plant retirements. We're going to be increasingly reliable on variable renewable energy, and we're going to need to operate our system to make sure that we are balancing, managing all that variable renewable energy. And we're going to be increasingly exposed to extreme weather, so we need to figure out how, given the increased, given more intense storms, given how intense fire seasons have become, we need to not just maintain the reliability, but figure out ways to make our energy systems more resilient over time. All of that points to a solution, to sort of the solution of virtual power plants. And I'll talk a little bit about why we see this as really a critical solution for addressing these needs of the grid. Whenever we talk about virtual power plants, it always behooves us to start talking about definitions and also some examples to help illustrate that. What is a virtual power plant? I'm borrowing the definition that the Department of Energy put out. We put out a report in January, and we had a pretty similar definition, but when Department of Energy put something out, it really seemed like a definition that industry could rally around. So VPPs are aggregations of distributed energy resources that can balance electricity demand and supply and provide utility scale and utility grade grid services. DERs, which is part of that definition, are equipment located on or near the site of end use that can provide electricity demand flexibility, electricity generation, storage, or other energy services at a small scale and are typically connected to the lower voltage distribution grid. This infographic on the right sort of plays this out and shows some of the technologies we're talking about. So when we're talking about the DERs, they can be components of VPPs. Those include rooftop solar, heat pumps, generally controlled by a smart thermostat, dishwashers, potentially battery storage, washers and dryers. I would say we actually don't have in this one, unless I'm missing it, electric hot water heaters with tanks are important solutions. Definitely we think about EVs, managed EV charging. I'll talk mostly about managed EV charging. There's a really exciting future, and we're starting to think about V2G, or the ability of EVs to dispatch to the grid. But we're really in early stages of that. So as I share some of the data and some of the projections for the industry, we're largely ignoring that, though that could really change things in the future. And then on the commercial side, there's a variety of technologies, commercial and large commercial industrial have and will continue to be really critical. So again, these are cited on the distribution side, but they can provide services similar to what would be provided by utility scale traditional generation. So we break down VPPs into two types. One we call a retail VPP, and this is essentially a program in most instances that's managed by electric utility. So in this instance, utility customers are going to be signed up to provide a service to the utility, and they're going to be paid for that by the utility. So in the DOE liftoff report, they provided a few examples, and if you look to the report, they'll actually provide some details and some of the economics of what these look like in a few examples. But I think essentially what you'd expect to see happening here, and to read this chart, these red lines are electricity services provided. So the services are provided by the consumers to the utility as needed in the form of demand response, in the forms of providing services to the grid. And payment takes the form, here we'll look on the right side, of participants with new battery systems of a monthly incentive, a per kilowatt hour export credit, new system bonus. So there's a variety of utility programs that you'll see sort of relatively similar structures to this. I think one program that I'll point to that many of our members sort of point to is starting to resemble best practices, Connected Solutions, which is a program that's managed by National Grid in Massachusetts, and it's a multi-technology, so it's inclusive of battery storage, but also other forms of demand flexibility, demand response. The other form, which we call market participant VPPs, I think there's other names to it, but it's essentially modes through which VPPs can directly provide services to the wholesale market, most often in the form of an RTO. So again, there's a critical role of a VPP aggregator in this, someone who's bringing together demand. The payment is provided by the wholesale market for services delivered. Most often those services are sort of providing capacity or resource adequacy, and they in turn pay their members. So there's many flavors of what this looks like. Again, another example with a different technology, but considering the option for battery storage providing service in an ISO or RTO. I think a key term on the policy front for folks familiar with this is Order 2222. Order 2222 was passed and essentially allowed or required RTOs, so PJM, MISO, and others, to figure out and develop rules so that aggregations of distributed energy resources could participate in the market basically on fair footing as other utility scale or other generation. Most markets are still figuring out exactly how to implement this, so we still have a long way to go. But nevertheless, sort of reflects the intent and the interest in finding ways for VPPs to be able to compete on an even footing in these wholesale markets by providing services and being paid for them. I think the other thing that is worth mentioning here is while Order 2222 from FERC has really opened things up for a variety of residential and small commercial customers, large commercial and industrial customers have been participating in wholesale markets and providing really valuable capacity services in particular for many years, and they're going to continue to do so, and they're a really important part of the VPP picture and the VPP story. Okay, so we talked definitions a little bit. Hopefully we grounded that. From there, I want to share a little bit about benefits of virtual power plants. Again, I'm borrowing from Department of Energy from their VPP liftoff report. They defined 7 benefits of VPPs. One is resource adequacy. Second is affordability. Third is reliability and resilience. Fourth is decarbonization and air pollution reduction. Transmission and distribution infrastructure relief. Community empowerment, versatility, and flexibility. I'm going to share some examples that speak to a few of these: resource adequacy, affordability, decarbonization. I'd encourage you to have a look at the report to sort of see some of the examples and hear some more of the explanation of some of the other benefits that VPPs can provide. So first, this is another great resource. Brattle Group put out a report earlier this year called Real Reliability. And it looked at the ability of virtual power plants to provide for resource adequacy, in other words, bulk system reliability. And they looked at the economics of them doing that compared to some other alternatives. What they found is that virtual power plants can provide for resource adequacy, and they can do so at lower cost than alternatives. So this chart here speaks to the economics a little bit, and I will talk through it. So you can sort of see the 3 main boxes from left to right, or 3 technology solutions evaluated. One is gas in the form of a new gas combustion turbine power plant. Second is battery in the form of a utility scale, large utility scale battery. And then finally, a virtual power plant. And this virtual power plant is a combination of a variety of demand-sited resources, including battery storage, managed charging, smart thermostats, among others. So, what did they find? So I think first looking at this dark blue column. So this is essentially what is the cost. The y-axis here is millions of dollars per year, the annualized net cost of providing 400 megawatts of resource adequacy. So in this instance, if you were looking at just a battery or a gas plant, the cost would be somewhere around or north of $70 million per year. But then when you look at virtual power plants, what would that cost be? And that cost would take the form, in most instances, of program costs and payments made to households that are participating in VPPs. The initial cost in that instance is less than $50 million. So you're starting from there. Brattle took it one step further, and they said, well, VPPs can provide a variety of benefits, which perhaps those other utility scale, sort of larger scale solutions might not provide. One would be reduced emissions. I'll talk in a subsequent slide about sort of the emissions story. There's one that's called resilience, which in this chart isn't included. They didn't quantify it here, but if you did quantify it, it would increasingly change the economics. Distribution and transmission. So this is the idea that VPPs can help either defer or avoid an investment in distribution and transmission. Ancillary services such as frequency regulation, voltage regulation, and other sort of types of services than energy, being able to essentially shift when energy is consumed and provide services to a wholesale market in that way. So essentially, when they put those all together, the story is pretty compelling that VPPs can provide for resource adequacy, and that's based on sort of another set of modeling they've done, and that they can do so affordably. The study's been pretty compelling. It's been picked up. It's been noticed in a variety of resources, but in places by regulators, utilities and others that are starting to think a little bit more seriously about VPPs as part of their resource planning and resource adequacy. So next, I wanted to share, and this is like a little bit dense here, but this is from some RMI pending analysis, a report that we're planning to release in either December or January, that is specifically looking at the greenhouse gas impacts of virtual power plants. So we as RMI, we fundamentally care about the energy transition, and we care about decarbonizing energy systems. So it's important for us to understand and communicate how virtual power plants can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So again, I'll talk you through this chart. We're missing a couple of pieces here. Specifically, there's going to be two y-axes. But this first dotted line is the hourly emissions rate of a system. In this instance, we're looking at Georgia in the year 2030. So we are looking here at sort of what would the emissions rate be over time. You start to see kind of resembling this duct curve. When solar comes on during the day, the grid is essentially cleaner. There's some details here that we probably don't need to get into about sort of what exactly is the marginal emissions rate that we use. Happy to talk about that a little bit if it makes sense. But essentially, I think intuitively it makes sense. We have more clean energy coming in the middle of the day. When the sun goes down, it starts to ramp up, and the emissions rate from the grid, this sort of average or marginal emissions from the grid that you rely on, increases. So then the second part is modeling what we would see from light transportation in this instance, from EVs. When would they be charging sort of all else equal versus when might they be charging if we're able to flex load? So in this instance, this chart shows from some sources we have about what we would expect the load to be, and this would be sort of this dark blue line into this gray line of what we would expect the charging profile to be, essentially all else equal. A lot of folks would come in, they would plug in their EVs when they get home, and they would charge for the next few hours. But what this does is if there's the ability to participate in a VPP and shift demand, we might find charging taking place at different places. Perhaps it's taking place at the office, and that'll be indicated by this green line. But it's one instance, and I think in this instance, we see both that VPPs are shifting demand away from the time of highest grid need and also shifting away from the time when there's higher emissions, and we're more reliant on fossil fuels. Again, this is some draft analysis we did, but we did some capacity expansion model, a case study looking at a jurisdiction, and we wanted to see, okay, well, what would this do to the resource capacity required, and would a sort of a cost optimized scenario involving VPPs allow for less build out or utilization of gas plants in particular. So to explain this analysis again, you can see the series on the right sort of describe the multiple colors we see here. And in the current system, there's a combination of coal. On top of that, there's gas capacity from gas combined cycle. On top of that is a red gas combustion turbine, looking at the stack on the left. Hydro, pump storage, wind, solar, some distributed solar, and there's some battery storage. So the scenario that we modeled, so first there was sort of like we allowed the system to model what the system would look like in 2035 if there were not virtual power plants. And then we inserted flexibility, in this instance, virtual power plants into the model to see what would happen. And we found that there was less build out of combined cycle gas plants, but there was actually increased build out, in particular of wind, as a result of this. And this is because this flexibility allows us to shift loads in a way that can ensure resource adequacy, can ensure reliability, and increasingly rely on wind to do so. So this is part of the story that's emerging that we're still sort of working on and planning to publish in a couple months, but looking at sort of how VPPs can drive decarbonization and related to that, reduce air pollution. All right, I'm gonna shift here from benefits a little bit to talking about market potential. Again, from the Department of Energy Liftoff report, I keep referencing it because they did such a great job of providing a framework paper that clarifies the current state and the prospects for virtual power plants. So I've leveraged it multiple times. And again, thank you to them for their work on that. So what's driving the growth of virtual power plants? Fundamentally, virtual power plant capacity depends on distributed energy resources being out there. So distributed energy resources in the form of distributed generation, flexible demand, behind the meter storage are going to scale and grow over time. I think you can see in these few charts what that's likely to what that might look like. On the left side is nameplate generation capacity additions from distribution fuel-based generators and distributed solar. So you can see from 2020 to 2030 an expected increase of 35 gigawatts nationwide. Flexible demand capacity additions, and this is only looking at a few solutions, but it's looking at residential water heaters, residential smart thermostats, and non-residential flexible demand. Again, we expect to see that increase. And on the right is nameplate storage capacity additions. And this is specifically behind the meter batteries and the expectation of adding up to 24 gigawatt hours. So again, that's gigawatt hours as opposed to gigawatts over the coming years. The big driver, certainly a big driver, is EV deployment. So they looked first at the nameplate demand capacity of electric vehicle chargers. So thinking of all the chargers, level 1, level 2, you know, if they're 5 kW, 10 kWs, whatever they might be, add all those up, what does it look like? We're expecting to see from 2020 to 2030 an additional 90 gigawatts of nameplate demand capacity from the chargers. And if you think of the batteries behind them, how much energy do they contain? Up to 540 gigawatt hours. So this is looking broadly at electric vehicles, and this sort of sets the stage for, wow, these distributed energy resources are really scaling. This is going to have some big impacts on what could potentially be managed, what could provide grid services in the form of virtual power plants. DOE put that all together and came to the conclusion that by 2030, VPPs could provide for 10 to 20% of US peak load. Another chart, I'll talk through it. So first, we have the sort of total peak demand currently as of 2023 in the United States. So this is coincident peak demand. Let's say it happens around, you know, the hottest day of the year, July 25th, sometime in the afternoon nationwide. It's around 740 gigawatts, and they estimated there's currently around 30 to 60 gigawatts of VPPs. So this is dominated, as I mentioned earlier, by commercial and industrial demand response. Over the coming years, we expect to see around 140 gigawatts of retirements of existing resources, largely coal and gas plants. And we're also expect to see around 200 gigawatts of additional demand to meet that gap from retirement as well as increasing demand. So DOE lays out a vision here where we could see a future of 80 to 160 gigawatts of VPPs by 2030s, where VPPs can do the lion's share of the work of covering that gap in resource adequacy to meet peak demand. Furthermore, they find that tripling current VPP scale by 2030 could address 10 to 20% of peak load, like I said, while saving around $10 billion per year in grid spending. We have found that to be a really compelling number, and I think we as an industry and we as Virtual Power Plant Partnership are increasingly rallying around that idea of what does it take for us to get that level of deployment, for us to get to 80 to 160 gigawatts of VPPs by 2030. Next, I want to share some recent trends, and this is some findings that I shared with our members when we had our a convening with our members just I guess 2 or 3 weeks ago in Boston. We got together, we talked about a lot of things, and I shared some thoughts and got some feedback on some of the trends that we're observing. So for 2023 industry trends indicate progress towards scaling VPP. I'll talk a little bit about them, what we're seeing, and certainly welcome observations or questions in the chat about what other folks might be seeing. One is DER adoption is ticking up. Second is VPP awareness is increasing. Third is that leading utilities are leaning in. Fourth is that more VPPs are announced, deployed, and dispatched. All right, number one. So DER adoption is the first imperative for VPP liftoff. We need DER adoption for there to be VPPs. On the EV front, we've seen a massive increase in people buying EVs. We've seen that for a few years, and certainly the past year. And these charts here show 2022 versus 2023. Q1 2022 compared to 2023, you saw a 63% increase in 2023. Q2 is around 48% increase, so we've certainly seen an uptake. I'll admit not everything on the DER side has been sort of really glowing this year. I know a couple aspects of the industry have seen some hard times, but in Q2 2023, we saw a record quarter for residential solar with 1.8 gigawatts installed nationwide. So we're definitely seeing that IRA and other factors are continuing to drive DER adoption. Second, and this is something that's really stood out to us from where we're sitting as virtual power plant partnership, is that VPP awareness has increased. I'll talk through this chart and share some observations that we've had anecdotally. So industry spoke, this is not the whole story, but I do think there's been a couple important reports out there that have helped shape thinking on the topic. We put out our virtual power plants real benefits report in January. Brattle put out sometime in spring or late winter, they put out their real reliability report, which was excellent. And then just a month ago, Department of Energy put out their virtual power plants liftoff report. Journalists listened. We're hearing these stories are getting picked up. There was a lot of interest when we initially launched VPP in January. And all of these stories are starting to get increasing interest. And then finally, and most importantly, decision makers tuned in. I realize the text is here, it's small, it might be hard to read, and the formatting got a little weird. But let me share sort of the specific observation and the broader observation. One of the key audiences that we look to influence as Virtual Power Plant Partnership is regulators. The main national conference for regulators is NCRES, National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, I believe. So even just in the course of this year, we've seen significant uptake in interest. If you look at the agendas of these conferences, there was about one VPP related event in the February NCRES, and then when they met again a few months later, there was 4. I would add to that, having been at both of those events, when I would speak to regulators in February, I would say maybe the 20 to 30% were familiar with VPPs, or at least like somewhat conversant. And just a few months later, that number had at least doubled. And I'd say more than half are familiar with VPPs, and more than half, and a significantly higher number, are very conversant. So VPPs are having a moment. Like I said, there's increased awareness across industry, including among sort of key decision makers who we're looking to influence. A third trend is that leading utilities are leaning in. So if you didn't see, this was just last week, I think, front page of the New York Times about Green Mountain Power, about their plan to end outages by giving their customer batteries. Now, they didn't necessarily in that article name it as virtual power plants. They chose some different language in New York Times, but it was about virtual power plants. It was talking about the Brattle study. It was referencing sort of this trend and this paradigm shift in how we're managing the grid and how we can manage for resilience. In addition to Green Mountain Power, which is certainly notable, PGE, Portland Gas and Electric in Portland, Oregon, has been a leader in their integrated resource plan they put out this year. There was a whole section for virtual power plants. That's not really something we would have seen traditionally and in the past. More often than not, VPPs would show up in some sort of corner of an energy efficiency or demand response program. So it's really becoming more key and integral to the work they're doing. For this crowd, I thought I'd add also sort of another leading example, and it's not necessarily new this year, but Holy Cross Energy, which is the utility where I sit here in Basalt, has been a leader. They have a variety of programs. One is their Power Plus, which is a battery storage program that they offer. So, leading utilities are really starting to lean in. They're making this part of the strategy, the way that they do business, and not just a program maybe they put in the side and they put in the corner. Finally, more VPPs are announced, deployed, and dispatched. You can see a few announcements there from across the country. Major Funding announcements from Department of Energy Loan Program Office. Texas had a notable program with its ADER pilot, aggregated DER pilot. Another one that I don't have here, but there's a program out of California you can look up called DSGS, which was announced this year, which is looking to really leverage VPPs to provide for resource adequacy to help California keep the lights on during those hottest times of the year when the grid can be really strained and challenged. Next, imperatives for growth. What do we need to do to see the virtual power plant industry grow? Again, I'm going to borrow from Department of Energy. I think they did a great job. They identified 5 imperatives for liftoff in their report. One is to expand DER adoption with equitable benefits. I'd emphasize this piece. I think the idea that we want to ensure that VPPs provide equitable benefits. Now, that does not always mean that we have equal participation in VPPs across all socioeconomic groups, but it does need to ensure that we are not in any way sort of cross-subsidizing from one group to another. We firmly believe that folks can benefit from being in the VPPs and being part of a VPP, and the grid as a whole can benefit because of reduced cost, and that is in many ways equitable benefits, and that's what we look to enable. But I think that's the key point. We need more DERs, and we need to ensure equitable benefits. I would add to that, though, just to be clear, we want to ensure that VPPs are accessible to a broad set of the population. So that's also important. That's sort of embedded in that idea. We can't have expanded DER adoption without ensuring that it's accessible to broad populations. Second, it's to simplify VPP enrollment, making it easy as possible for people to participate in VPPs. To increase standardization in VPP operations, a key challenge across the industry is sort of non-standard use, in particular data interoperability between devices. So as much as possible that we can standardize will be really important. Integrating into utility planning and incentives, making sure that utilities have the right programs and that they're thinking about this in an integrated planning perspective. And finally, integrating into wholesale markets, whether that's through Order 2222 or other pathways to ensure that, FERC Order 2222 that is, or other pathways to ensure that VPPs can participate. With that, I'll share a little bit about what we're doing as Virtual Power Plant Partnership. So, you know, I think we took a slightly different tack than DOE in framing the barriers to industry growth. You can see that on the left. The way we broke it down is there's wholesale electricity market rules issues. Often this takes the place of rules and RTOs. How can VPPs be able to equitably and fairly participate in wholesale markets? Second is retail utility programs and offerings. Essentially, more utilities need to have programs. We need consumers in all states to be able to participate in VPPs, and they need to be good programs. They need to be fair, and they need to fairly compensate customers for the services they provide through VPPs. Finally, we need more industry and policymaker awareness. We do 3 things around that: education, convening, direct support. This is a little bit of what we're starting to reflect. We launched the VP3 back in January, and it's been a really great time for us to launch. We've had a lot of success over this past year, and just to share a few of the things that we've been doing, and then to share a little bit what we're looking to do in the future. We engaged and educated congressional staff to set the stage for federal action with the DOE Loans Program Office, AEMA, and Rewiring America. So that's my colleague Lauren, who's up there briefing Senate staffers, along with 2 of the 3 members of the Energy Gang, for folks who used to listen to that podcast, Jigger Shaw and Catherine Hamilton, who's the executive director of AEMA. So, you know, I think that there's not a real strong, at this point in time, the focus is usually, for us, is on state action as opposed to federal action, but it's really important for us to be engaging and educating Capitol Hill policymakers around virtual power plants. Second is we've connected with regulators. We hosted a luncheon at NCRES. We continue to talk to regulators all the time to help educate and help ensure that they're well positioned to develop effective VPP policies. We had a webinar with electric cooperatives, and one thing I note, and there's a lot of cooperatives across Colorado, is cooperatives have really been leaders on virtual power plants. And I think part of the reason is whereas investor-owned utilities often have a capital bias, which encourages them to invest in new gas plants or wire solutions as opposed to VPPs. That bias doesn't necessarily exist for rural electric cooperatives. So we put together a webinar that was focused in particular on a set of New Era, which is some funding that came through IRA in the Inflation Reduction Act. And we heard from some co-ops, including Brian Hannigan of Holy Cross Energy and Cyril Brunner of Vermont Electric Cooperative. Both of those cooperatives are doing really great, innovative things when it comes to virtual power plants. So it's a chance for us to educate other cooperative leaders as well. We educated industry and key audiences. We've spoken at a lot of conferences, part of the work that we do. And then we grew our VP3 community to 26 members. We're really proud of that. We launched in January and we've grown a lot through that time. Finally, and this will be my final slide, is just wanted to give you a sense of how we're working and the work that we're doing, and maybe that stimulates some questions you might have. So we have 4 working groups with our members. One is around communicating the VPP story. It's really broadly around communication, how we can work together around communication. We have one body of work we're doing there called a VPP brand campaign, and it's really thinking broadly about how we in this industry can align our strategies when it comes to communicating virtual power plants. And the next is the resource repository, figuring out how we can sort of put together many of the great resources so that they're accessible, first of all, to our members, and then ultimately to a broader public. We have a regulatory and policy working group. A couple of priorities in the near term for them are around defining some VPP policy principles. Some others have done that, but our members have expressed interest in sort of articulating them and putting those out there so they can be useful to regulators and others, and sort of continuing to articulate and refine a regulatory strategy. An important part of our work is not just influencing regulators, but also figuring out ways that we can work with utilities directly. So we're developing a utility flipbook, which is essentially a compilation of case studies from utilities to help educate utilities who might be considering developing programs to help them understand best practice. And also bringing together utilities with industry, our VP3 members, through workshops and convenings. It's really important for us to understand and listen to utilities to understand their pain points when it comes to VPPs, so we can figure out as an industry and as VP3 how we can best address those. And then we have a working group focused on data communications and interoperability. There's a lot of issues there. One issue that we've been focusing on is there's a wide variety of expectations from wholesale markets in particular when it comes to what data is required from VPPs, how often it's required, the nature of it. And that can be really onerous and really difficult and can, in many instances, kind of kill the business model. So we're looking just to sort of profile and understand what practice is across different RTOs, across different regional transmission organizations when it comes to what's expected for data and communications from VPPs. Finally, we as VP3 will be showing up at conferences and events to represent VPP industry. We get calls and inquiries from regulators, policymakers, utilities, so responding to those. I think a really important thing to note is we are focused on VPPs, but there's a lot of organizations there who are fellow travelers who work with many of our members and are focused on growing the VPP industry. So ensuring that we're aligned and collaborating with them. And another theme, I mentioned this earlier, but integrating equity and accessibility into our VP3 strategy outputs and collaboration. This is important both for the sustainability of the industry. It's also critically important for us as RMI. It's part of our mission, thinking about an equitable energy transition. So we want to make sure that this continues to show up and that we keep asking questions about how we can ensure that VPP industry and that VPPs are deployed in a way that's accessible and equitable. I have my contact information there. Thank you. And yeah, I'd welcome questions. I think, Pete, you're going to share some.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Kevin. Let's just jump into it. Okay, here we go. How do we educate the public so that the non-tech folks can visualize what connection to a VPP could mean to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I realized as I was going through this, and I think I'm speaking to the right audience here, but I'm like, man, there's a lot of wonky language in this. this is not the presentation that necessarily resonates with the general audience. And frankly, a lot of the ways we've been communicating virtual power plants is not necessarily a way that communicates. So let me share two sort of competing thoughts that I've heard. I think one is essentially the general public does not need to be aware of virtual power plants. Essentially, that we should find ways that they can be as often as possible automatically enrolled, and they can participate in a way that just doesn't inconvenience them. They have full ability to override whenever VPP is dispatched, so they can sort of have control over the devices. So I think that's sort of idea one, like maybe we just don't really need to communicate it, but we can make it as automatic as possible. A second idea that we've heard is maybe we do need to communicate it, but we need to think about different terminology for communicating it. To be fully honest, I'm not sure if virtual power plant is really the right language to use with end use consumers. And I think we've heard this from our members. It's sort of the term that we have. It's in our title. It's something that we're sticking with. I've heard other people present other alternatives. Community power plant is one. I think that's can be intriguing and could have some legs with it. So I think it's a great question. I don't have the answer to it. I can share part of our work is awareness. As we think about awareness and sort of like how we as VP3 are enabling awareness. Our initial focus is on regulators and utilities, recognizing that we need to have the policies in place. We allow our members to be thinking about ways that they can best communicate and engage with the general public, but I think there's also an opportunity for us more broadly as an industry to explore, to kick the tires and figure out ways that can be really effective in communicating this broadly.
Okay. How do we make VPP interconnection affordable given the cost of DER adoption?
Yeah. So just to play back the question and then maybe to interpret it, it was how do we make VPP interconnection affordable given the cost of DER adoption? So yeah, let's talk, I might sort of take that and talk a little bit about how do we overcome sort of some of these upfront cost barriers to DER adoption. And I think this connects to the ideas of how we can make VPPs accessible. I think it's a challenge. I think a couple things that stand out are essentially solutions that we can use, financing solutions we can use to overcome some of those upfront costs. So I think one option is a variety of sort of utility financing models. Pay as you save is one model that we're seeing adopted in a few places. I think you can Google and look that up, which is essentially an opportunity where the utility can help finance the project and you're able to sort of get those savings over time when it comes to the bills. I think another idea is how can we sort of in any way sort of I guess monetize future cash flows from grid services that a VPP would provide, and how can we bring those forward to buy down the cost of a device over time? So I think these are things that different folks are looking into. Again, I've mentioned a few times, but the Loan Program Office is really eager to find models that can help buy down the cost and sort of enable greater access to VPPs. They have issued and announced one loan to date when it comes to VPPs, and that's with Sonova. And that project from Loan Program Office was specifically looking at providing low and moderate income households with solar and battery storage.
Great. What role, if any, do you see AI having in the optimization of VPPs?
That's a great question. I'm not a technologist, so I can't speak specifically to how AI shows up as opposed to other solutions. I think what I could share, in one observation, sort of when it comes to like the role of VPPs, a lot of the way that we operate the grid, yes, it has changed over time, but in many ways it's the way that we sort of using many of the same solutions that we could have used for the past 20 to 30 years. When we think about how do we sort of apply sort of the dramatic transformation of information technology that's emerged over the past, over the past decade to the power system, to me, that really shows up when you're trying to manage the complexity of a much more distributed grid. So whether it's AI or whether it's other sort of forms of, intelligence derived from information technology. I think it's sort of fundamental to the work that happens here. I suspect many of our members do use AI in sort of enabling for the grid to be managed and sort of supporting VPPs. There's a variety of ways it shows up, and just to name a few that it might show up in, I think there's maybe aspects of how we're managing the distribution system, whether that's through a DERMS provider, which is sort of a term for technology that manages the distribution system that could potentially leverage AI. I also think about some of the ways that we're trying to understand what was the actual impact of an intervention, which has to do with how we're measuring and verifying VPPs. And I think there's a lot of ways that we could use AI to sort of help understand what's happened over time and sort of what the impact of a VPP has been, and therefore how it should be compensated for that.
Okay. What are the mechanics of VPP management that allows the VPP to control/reduce peak demand, basically the finite control of smart resources?
Yeah. So, I think I spoke to this a little bit, and hopefully I'm going to interpret this question correctly. What are the mechanics of VPP management? So, I think I point to that DOE liftoff report again with some great examples. Say, one of our members is Ohm Connect and they're really active in California. So what do they do when there's sort of an urgent grid event in California? Well, they have a variety of tools they can do. One is they have behavioral programs where they can send text messages to their members, and they can encourage them to reduce demand. In some ways they gamify it. In other ways they find ways to directly compensate and reward folks for reducing demand. So that's option one. I think option two is they have, in many of their homes, they have ways to sort of directly control some loads. And that's oftentimes, there's a few ways that this can be done, but let's assume here that there's sort of Wi-Fi connected devices, whether that's, whether it's plug loads or whether it's, a smart thermostat like a Google Nest, and they can be sort of toggled and changed in a variety of ways. And then finally, the same could happen with an EV charger. So I think that's sort of an example of what that could look like. Similarly, especially when devices are Wi-Fi enabled, you could send a device and a battery could be discharged as well. I'd say the one thing that increasingly it looks like it is not, and I think is an important point to make, some utility programs in particular have looked to ways for sort of like more direct demand control, where they, lock people out of their smart thermostat when they have an event. That has not landed well with the general public. So I think it's pretty clear from our members that that is not the approach. So even if they are remotely controlling your device, the consumer will always be able to have some form of override over that dispatch.
Great. What's the biggest resistance you think IOUs have to adoption of VPPs?
Yeah, I think there's a few theories about it. I would say fundamentally there's one key audience that we need to convince are, what we call the operators of the system. So there's a set of people out there who are responsible above all for making sure that the lights stay on, and that's a really important job they take seriously. In the past, they've been able to do so through a variety of solutions. So if you're looking at sort of how they're providing for, ensuring that they have adequate capacity on distribution transmission system, they're buying hardware that they understand really well, whether it's a transformer or something else, it's under warranty. So they can rely on that, and they've known they could rely on that. Similarly, if you're on the planning side of things, there's a certain understanding of what natural gas power plants can provide. There's some contractual obligations that would allow them to sort of ensure that they can provide those in the future. So there's a sense of trust in this, and virtual power plants sort of requires people to change their paradigm, change their thinking about it. If I'm thinking about the option of a non-wire solution, maybe you can go out and buy a transformer and you can expect it to be there for, I don't know how many years, let's say 20 to 30 years, and maybe you can get a warranty for it. You're gonna have to replace that, and you're gonna have to replace that mindset to say, well, I can get a service agreement for a virtual power plant. It's gonna be for a much shorter term, but I'm going to expect that there's gonna continue to be virtual power plant capacity going forward. Furthermore, you're going to say, well, I'm going to have to rely on sort of a variety of homes to participate in this event, as opposed to sort of to provide for resource adequacy, as opposed to a single natural gas generator that I can point to, that I can see, and I know whether or not it will. So I think, a really key challenge is trust among operators. I think another issue that's been named is sort of the utility bias towards capital intensive solutions. That's how most investor owned utilities get paid. So I think if we can look at solutions like performance-based rate making or other forms of regulatory reform that sort of remove or shift that bias towards capital intensive solutions, that can certainly be helpful.
Okay. What are some of the ways that a market participant VPP would reduce the risk having sufficient device connectivity to meet an accepted day-ahead offering in an RTO, i.e. reducing exposure to real-time market procurement?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there's a lot of nuance around it, and I think it's something that our members could speak to better. Let me just name a couple dynamics that's important. So, I think one is there's ultimately going to be some probabilistic assumption that if you have an event, you're going to dispatch, say, a bunch of residential devices. Not every single one is going to respond. So I think you need to, as you're planning, figuring out how much capacity you're bidding in, you need to in some way discount to account for that. The other thing that's really important, really challenging, I think the VPP operators understand it, but is that to a certain extent, VPP capacity is weather dependent. So what do I mean by that? So, I think if I am looking at what is the benefit to the California power system if I set back or pre-cool, let's say 100,000 houses using a smart thermostat, what is that benefit? Well, that benefit's going to be a lot higher if it's 100 degrees as opposed to if it's 70 degrees. So the VPPs, and this might be another place where they may be using artificial intelligence or are sort of figuring out and understanding what that needs to be. But one place where regulation has been lagging is measurement and verification of sort of the service provided does not always sort of fully account for that weather dependency. So again, I think that answer may have not fully addressed your question, but it sort of points to a couple of the dynamics which would inevitably be at play for a VPP that's looking to provide those wholesale services.
Have you addressed excess backfeed to the grid from residential high DER zones?
Yeah, I think it's an important issue. For most of the country, it's not a big issue. For some places, it's becoming an issue. For other international jurisdictions, it's becoming an issue. And to name one, Australia. We have a few members within VP3 who are from Australia, and Australia, I think as y'all are aware, really has massive distributed solar penetration, and that's driven by really low cost solar combined with high cost for grid electricity. Where I understand we've gotten to a point now where there's really an operational challenge where, hearing from folks anecdotally that it's like we are starting to fry the grid in parts of Australia. So what is the role of VPPs in providing for that? It's a great question. I don't necessarily have the solution. I think sort of as I think of the hierarchy of solutions that we're providing through VPPs, the one that has been primarily focused on is resource adequacy, keeping the lights on, making sure that we have enough generation during those times of really high grid needs. Sort of we go down from there where I think we're starting to look at non-wire solutions. How can VPPs also avoid undue or high investment, in particular in the distribution system and to a certain extent the transmission system? I think when we think about that, we need to be thinking both about sort of how can we sort of avoid upgrades that would be driven, I guess, by by electrification, by sort of increasing demand on that circuit, but also thinking about upgrades or challenges or investments that would be triggered by backfeeding, by excess backfeeding. So that's a great question. Yeah, to be fully honest, I'm not aware of a VPP, at least I'm not aware of a VPP that has been sort of like implemented with that express purpose, but I think that's part of the promise, ideally and hopefully, of sort of being able to manage places where we're having high levels of backfeed and sort of reducing and managing that.
Great. What is the status of appliance and other consumer product manufacturers getting on board with including VPP tech into new products?
Yeah. So you look at our membership, we don't have any appliance makers on that. And in many ways, I think it'd be great to have appliance makers as part of it. But I think generally the sense that I get, and this may change over time, maybe we will have some appliance makers that are part of our membership. They just want to be told what they need to do. I don't think they really want to focus sort of shifting their business model to try to get some marginal value streams from VPPs. So like, I think one place that I think DOE can provide some leadership, and they seem to be interested in providing some leadership, is providing some standards. So whether it's sort of analogous to the energy efficiency standards that we've seen for devices, is there also a component of sort of grid interactiveness that can be applied? So just sort of how does it operate? How does it communicate with sort of other devices in the home or aggregators, et cetera? So that would be one place, sort of looking just to sort of have them step up and comply. The other place that I'd be really interested is, we mentioned we need to make it a lot cheaper for customers to enroll in VPPs. One way that could happen is by enrollment at the initial point of sale. So I don't know exactly what that might look like, but the idea is that if you're buying a new hot water heater, how can we set things up so that you're automatically enrolled in a VPP, or at least it makes it as easy as possible for you to enroll in a VPP to be able to have that electric hot water heater provide those grid services, but without you or having to go around and developing a new relationship and being sold by a VPP, et cetera. How can we make that as efficient as possible?
Okay, what are the biggest barriers to VPP adoption in a regulated market like Colorado?
Yeah, I'm gonna answer the question of regulated market like Colorado. I don't know if I can speak exactly to the specifics of Colorado per se. I mean, the number one barrier more often than not is there a VPP program? So there's a variety of structures this can take, right? But I think a common structure in vertically integrated utility markets is that most customers would participate in VPPs, if you're residential and small commercial, through a utility program. So then the question becomes, number one, is there a utility program in place? In many jurisdictions, there's not a utility program, or if there is, it's not highly compelling. And then I guess the second part, is the utility program compelling? Is it adequately lucrative to encourage customers to participate? And I guess third, is it easy to sign up? So I guess maybe to talk a little bit about Excel, this is, I guess, just what I've heard from other folks, but I think we've seen in a variety of jurisdictions. Oftentimes, utilities have sort of multiple technology programs. So if you want to do VPP, you can go to the utility, you can sign up for your smart charging program, you can sign up for your smart thermostat program, you can sign up for your battery storage program. You really need to be dedicated to take all of those steps, especially because sometimes it can be onerous to take all those steps. So what we're seeing as best practice is more integrated programs. I mentioned before, connected solutions out of Massachusetts, out of National Grid out there, I think is sort of emerging as a best practice, because it is multi-technology and is compensating at a rate that it makes it interesting or exciting for customers to participate.
Okay, great. All right, next question here. And this kind of goes to the the utility bias that you've brought up a few times. How do you, when you have a utility that's looking down the road towards increased demand and looking at investing in a new gas asset to be dispatchable to cover, these higher peak loads, how do you get them to assess and compare the benefits of a VPP against an asset investment? Is there any kind of things that you've seen that have guided utilities to really make that valuation in a fair way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think a few pieces that are somewhat potentially chronological. I think first is like just really introducing in the whole conversation around that utility and regulators of that utility that, okay, there are alternatives. And I think we're starting to see this show up more and more. And again, I've talked about increased awareness for VPPs and about the importance of reports like Brattle. Brattle's report, and Brattle's really well respected. So if they say something, it's like, okay, maybe we need to be thinking about this. And who's the we there? Oftentimes it's the regulator saying, maybe we need to instruct the utility, maybe we need to scrutinize this analysis to think more about VPPs. So a regulator might say, can you look at that again? Can you consider whether a VPP would provide these services or not? Then is the next challenge, and this is, I think, one of the operational challenges that utilities face. Because in order them to fairly do that assessment, that means the planners are going to have to start talking to other people. And this is, not to like throw shade at utilities, but like this can be really challenging because oftentimes what we're seeing the leading utilities are needing to put together these multidisciplinary teams involving people from IT, involving people from their distribution planning system, involving people from their customer programs, and having them get together and say, okay, well, what are you expecting? What are you seeing? How can we model for this? How much are we paying for this? I think those are a couple of the pieces that need to be in place. I've mentioned a lot of our work, or sort of one of the things that we've been encouraged by our members to focus on from the onset is on the regulatory, and this is sort of based on the recognition that oftentimes the regulators are going to be the ones that are motivating the utilities to do the work. I'd say an interesting place where we may start to see utilities starting to look increasingly at VPPs is I think more and more utilities are starting to grasp sort of what they will need to do and what their distribution system will need to accommodate when it comes to electrification-driven load growth. And they're realizing, wow, we either can't build fast enough or it's going to be really hard for us to build fast enough. So that's sort of an instance of where utilities don't want to be caught in a position where they're just unable to accommodate or serve load. So I think that might be another sort of motivator for utilities, sort of taking the lead as opposed to having to be directed by the regulators.
Great. This next question, I think you may have covered, but let's hit it. Does RMI have educational programs focused on VPPs that can be made available to educate board members of municipal utilities and obviously REAs as to the potential of VPP adoption? So kind of going to the regulators for non-regulated entities.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the one resource that I can point you to in the near term, and I think it's up on our website, vp3.io, is the webinar we put together with rural electric cooperatives it was specifically around New Era, which is the funding opportunity, but I think there might be some other more applicable insights. We're working on creating more documents that can be relevant and useful, and sort of in the coming months, the sort of near-term products, that utility flip book that I referenced earlier, which provides a set of case studies. So it's a great question, and I think a great thing that we're sort of trying to think about how we can work on that and how we can ensure that we are able to have, scaled in ways to get the message out.
Okay, sorry, it's kind of a long one. Are there any current legislative / lobbying efforts to explore additional economics of potential for carbon offset credits to increase economics of a VPP, such as when reducing peak demand, when typically a gas peaker would be fired up and emitting?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess maybe to think just a little bit about what's the, where are we seeing activity when it comes to capturing that carbon benefits from virtual power plants. So I spoke previously to sort of some of the dynamics around how virtual power plants can help drive decarbonization, both near term and long term. Yeah, I think the second is, okay, what are we seeing with respect to that? So, I think another key theme that's worth mentioning is virtual power plants in most instances are sort of called on infrequently to provide for resource adequacy. So sort of during those times when the grid is really strained. If we want to capture those carbon benefits, in most instances, we need to think about ways that we can call on VPPs more often without inconveniencing the consumers. So that could require, in many instances, sort of changes to the utility programs or how VPPs are operating in markets. What is the legislative opportunity associated with that? It's a good question. I think a couple of things, like in Colorado, I think the fact, I don't know exactly how it's exercised, but if there's sort of like a price of carbon that's used for dispatching different power plants, that could really nudge you towards lower zero carbon solutions. So I think that would be sort of one solution that could be helpful. Another domain, and you mentioned sort of carbon offsets, another domain where I think, we're seeing some interesting effort, and we have another effort in RMI called ZGI, or Zero Grid Initiative. And this is sort of focused on large energy buyers that are motivated to do the most they can to drive grid-wise, sort of grid scale decarbonization. So they'd be interested in supporting a variety of things, both including thinking about how they can support build out of transmission to drive decarbonization, but also thinking about when energy is used and how they can sort of leverage their energy procurement to best ensure that the grid will decarbonize as rapidly as possible.
Okay, and this is a bit of a long one here. Your thoughts on impediments created by residential inverter manufacturers who aren't pushing IEEE 2030.5 communications protocol down to the device level, but keeping it at the cloud so that they can charge fees for aggregating the devices. This forces utilities with DERMS to pay high monthly per device fees to the manufacturers or contract with aggregators who provide APIs to the manufacturers and charge slightly lower per monthly device fees. Do you see the market forcing the manufacturers to make 2030.5 capabilities available at the device level in the future in the spirit of open communication standards that are truly open?
Yeah, so again, I can't speak to all the nuance, but I can speak to a couple of the dynamics at play. So I mentioned we have a data communications interoperability working group. And one of the themes that they started to explore was the use of standards in sort of VPPs, and essentially starting with the premise of like, is there a standard that we should be supporting, that we should be advocating for? And there's a variety of standards out there, and I'm not familiar with all of them exactly, but one is CIM, there's OpenADR, and I'm not exactly sure sort of like the domains they cover, which ones they don't cover. But the initial idea was, do we need to be advocating for a single standard? I think what became clear over time is that standards are ways of sort of like, I guess sort of like languages for how we package the data. But beyond and in addition to that, there's questions of like, what are the actual data that are being required? like with what frequency does that data need to be communicated? In this instance, if we're talking to a market, et cetera. So I guess sort of insight one is that even if a specific market, and this is like an organized market, is sort of adopting a standard, they're not always sort of uniformly applied. And then there's also important questions about how and how much data is communicated that is sort of outside the purview of the standard. So that's not, it sounds like there's a really clear pain point that's felt by the person who wrote this question, around these things. So I can't really speak to that per se. But I think one of the insights that we've had is it's not all about the standards. Yeah, standards are important. Yeah, standards are helpful. And I think there's a variety of benefits that can come and costs that can be saved if we can standardize as much as possible. But even if we have everyone agree to adopt a single standard, there's a variety of data issues that need to be resolved for the industry to operate efficiently.
Okay, and the question after that was almost identical to the question you just answered, so we're going to skip over that one. So obviously the inverter communication is on people's minds. Okay, can you speak to the potential of retail VPP programs in different markets across the country, ranging from high DER, time of use, post-net metering markets to emerging DER, flat tiered rate, one-to-one net energy metering markets? How could the value propositions or program structures differ?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Part one is sort of like where to look for, I guess, potential and growth for VPPs. So, I think one thing that our members have clearly communicated, and I think I've shared in this report, is that in order to have VPPs, you need to have DERs. So if you're looking at places for high potential for VPPs, you start by looking at places for high deployment of DERs. So not surprisingly, California has a lot of DERs. California has a lot of VPPs. That's also driven by sort of the grid demands in California, and in particular resource adequacy. So I think that's sort of dimension one to consider. The second dimension that you mentioned was around rates, including net metering rates, and how does that interface with sort of VPPs? It's an interesting, it's a very good question, and sort of a complicated question, one I don't know if I have an easy answer to. So, I think one is just to name it, I think there are those who would argue very effectively and eloquently that, like, perhaps instead of VPPs and developing programs, we should just have better rates. And I think that makes a lot of sense in many instances. Can we have dynamic or sort of like highly dynamic time of use rates, and does that obviate the need for VPPs? It might, but I think VPPs, whether or not they're sort of a permanent solution or a stepping stone, allow us to provide revenue streams so that devices can participate and be compensated, because consumers don't want to be responsible for turning their thermostat up and down. They want, if we're going to have highly dynamic prices, we want devices that can be smart and can manage things in that way. So that, that's one. And then I think the second question is sort of like, to what extent is changes in net metering, how does that impact or influence sort of VPP deployment? I think there's a really big role for it. And I think, I think in different places where we're seeing, an evolution of net energy metering that really requires the solar industry to sort of think about what services it's providing to maximize benefits to consumers. And in many instances, this is what involves going beyond solar to thinking about how can we also be providing consumers with batteries, and how can we be sort of signing them up for a variety of sort of demand flexibility and other solutions, so that they are, provides a little bit more of an integrated solution.
Great. How do we measure and verify a DER's value to the grid before the prosumer who makes the DER investment negotiates with the VPP aggregator for fair compensation?
Yeah. So I think the premise is great and would make sense that the prosumer has that sort of ability to negotiate over how much it gets paid. Unfortunately, I think usually prosumers are price takers when it comes to VPP programs and revenue from VPP programs, unless you're a large C&I customer. So maybe that will evolve over time. But how do we measure and verify DER value? One company that not a VPP member, but I think they do some interesting work in the space is a company called Recurve. So they do a lot of work around analytics and looking at sort of what is the impact of a VPP. So you might check out their website to see a little bit about how they're communicating, sort of measuring the impact of VPPs. And I think there's a couple. Yeah, so I think among the work that I've seen from them is and one solution that can be helpful is yeah, I don't know. I guess just as much transparency can be provided, and it's kind of complicated and depends on the service provided. But if we get clear on the value of the ultimate grid service provided, then we can get a little bit clear on sort of what the individual device contribution can be to it.
Okay, here. And just to answer, I keep getting the question, Kevin, I was going to ask you afterwards, but would you be able to share the slide deck with us? I know you've got some of the pre-publication stuff. If you want to sanitize that, that would be fine.
Yeah, Pete, I can share that with you, and I might sanitize a couple of those pre-publication, but otherwise, yeah, happy to share.
Okay. Why would your average utility customer, being residential, want to allow VPP principles applied to their residents? As it is, how many utility customers have accepted the remote control switch on their air conditioner?
Yeah, so the question is, why would a customer participate in a VPP? I think there's a variety of motivators. I think just to start with the economic, which we assume a lot of folks do, and I think there's an evaluation there, is the benefit that I get in terms of payment for being part of a VPP, does that exceed any inconvenience that being part of a VPP may provide? In many instances, it's going to be the case. In particular, when a VPP can be operated to sort of have pretty much zero impact on the user experience. So I think a good example of this is EV charging. Maybe you come home after work, you plug in your EV, maybe you need it charged by the morning and you already have 50%, 60% charge in there. Do you really care if it's charging between 5 and 8, right when you get home, or if it's charging later in the evening when there's less stress on the grid? So I think that'd be example one. How much do you need to be paid for that? And would you be willing to do that? So that's sort of an example of sort of the economic considerations. I don't think that's the only example though, and I think really a good example for this is, fortunately, the summer wasn't too bad in California, but back in September 2022, there was a lot of strain on the grid. The one tool, or one of the tools that was utilized was text messages going to energy users in California saying, hey, can you turn down your power? We need to turn down the lights. So essentially just as voluntary summoning for people to turn down their power usage. And it worked. It kept the lights on in California. So I think, what does that speak to? I think folks are motivated not just by the economic benefits. They didn't get paid for that unless they were part of a VPP, but they did so because they felt a certain commitment and obligation to their community. So I think that's another reason. I think we can go down other reasons. I think, more and more as we can think about and leverage VPPs to provide climate benefits. I think there's consumers out there who might be motivated by that as well. So I think those are some of the considerations that consumers might have in mind as they think about participating in the VPP.
Okay, have you seen any participation in VPPs from subscribed community solar gardens?
I'm not aware of any examples. I think that's great. I think that's consistent with the sort of broad definition that we in DOE have of VPPs, which includes, in so much as you want to consider a solar garden, let's assume it's distributed generation, then it would be part of the VPP definition. So I think it would be possible, but I don't know of any specific examples.
Okay. The DOE report might cover this, but considering the vast number of connected devices required to make DER aggregate to utility scale, what are some of the cybersecurity developments we are seeing to improve consumer confidence and increase VPP adoption?
It is a good question. I think it's an important question. It's a question that utilities are concerned with. I can't, I don't think I have any specific insights on some of the cybersecurity. I think it's touched on to a certain extent in the DOE report, but not in great depth.
Okay. Oh, just sort of a comment. Fort Collins utilities used to pay a small fee for participating in their peak energy program, but don't do it anymore. And perhaps less people participate because of that. Let's go on to this one. In the Colorado Public Utilities case for a VPP on Excel, Recurve testified that for them to launch a VPP, they only need Excel to give them a hunting license for prosumers. Is that what you mean by giving, is that what you mean by the prosumer will just be a price taker?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I guess I can maybe back off or walk back a little bit that statement. I guess it depends whether or not a consumer is a price taker. Again, I've mentioned this a few times, but this National Grid Connected Solutions Program, you can look it up. You get paid sort of a certain amount based on the device that you can bring, and I think that's a pretty common structure. Understand what the device is, what it's, and that's sort of what it is, dollars per device. Sometimes it has a per kW component to it. It's so I think that is sort of, I guess, like one model, but yeah, we might see an evolution of a variety of models. It might not always be that consumer's the price taker, but usually if it's a utility program, I would say the utilities sort of define the terms, what they're willing to pay.
Okay. All right, I think we're at the end of for the second, so I'm gonna go ahead and call it there. Definitely, Kevin, very much appreciate you taking the time tonight. I know we kind of did a later one than normal, but for everyone out there, feel free to email me at the info@cres-energy.org. Give me till tomorrow, so if you want a copy of that presentation, and then once I get the update from Kevin, I'll get that out to you all. Otherwise, Kevin, thanks again, and really appreciate the work that you all do at RMI to help kind of push forward the energy transition. It really can't go fast enough for a lot of us, and we'll go ahead and let you go, and thank everyone for joining us here tonight, and look forward to the next discussion.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right, good evening.